In this video, we want to talk about measuring the macroeconomy, measuring the size of the economy in total, and looking at measures of size and of methods of calculating the size of the economy. We're going to start by looking at the gross domestic product. Now, this is a measure of the value of the economic activity within a country. The GDP, the gross domestic product, is the sum of the market values or prices of all final goods and services produced in an economy during a period of time. So all final goods and services. It does not include work in progress or semi-finished goods. So it's the value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy in a given period of time. There are three important points to note. GDP is a number that expresses the worth of the output of a country in its local currency. So it's denominated in the local currency, whatever that is. The euro, the pound, the dollar, whatever it is. GDP tries to capture the value of all final goods and services produced within the country. So it tries to work out all the final goods and services and work out their value and add them up. And it's calculated in a specific period of time, usually a year. So we say the GDP for 2000 was something and the GDP for 2010 was something else, and so on. So it's within a specific time period. The Gnp calculation, the gross national product, provides a standard basis for the comparison of economic performance across both time and different countries. So Gnp includes different countries. And we'll see how this works. It doesn't actually include the different countries. It includes residents from the country working in different countries. Now let's look at computing the gross domestic product, GDP. GDP is the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within a country for a given period of time, a given year, let's say. And that's what we've already mentioned in the earlier slides. So for example, assume that country X only produces apples and onions. So we'll just take a very simple economy, country X, and it only produces apples and onions. It doesn't produce anything else, just to show how it works. So here's our country X, and here's the production of apples and of onions, and here are the prices of the apples and onions for different years. I've got 3 years here, year 1, 2, and 3. Now, the GDP for the country in year 1, it's highlighted in red here, equals the quantity of apples times the price of apples plus the quantity of onions times the price of onions. So if we look, the price of apples is £1 and 6 apples are produced. So it's 6 times 1 plus 5 onions are produced. The price of onions are £3. So it's 5 times 3, 15. 15 and 6, 21. So in this case, the GDP is 21. As more goods and services are produced, obviously this equation becomes very long because we have to work out the quantities of each good produced and the price of each good. In general, macroeconomists, people who study the macroeconomy, study the economy in total, they use a standard set of categories to break down the economy into its major constituent parts. In these instances, GDP, gross domestic product, is the sum of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. These are represented by the equation y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. So y is the total GDP. We call it y. It's a convention in economics that the GDP is called y. The national income is called y. The reason for that is because a famous writer called John Maynard Keynes very famous economist in the 1930s. In 1936, he wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And in there, he called it Y. So Y stuck. So whenever we see Y in economics, it means in macroeconomics, it means the national income. In microeconomics, Y also means income. It's just based on what Keynes did. There's no great reason for it. So Y equals C, consumption or consumer expending. Investment expenditure is I, and G is government expenditure, and NX is net exports. X for exports. Now, because this equation, Y equals C plus I plus G plus X plus NX, I should say, Y captures every segment of the economy. Y represents both GDP and national income. It captures everything here. This is because when money changes hands, its expenditure, the expenditure of one party and income for another. So the expenditure of one is the income of another. And Y captures all these values. Therefore, it represents the net of the entire economy. So when we have expenditure, one person's expenditure is another person's income. And this is what captures it. So we have now got an expression which can calculate the GDP of the economy. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumer expenditure is the sum of expenditures by households on durable goods, non-durable goods and services. So it includes clothing, fooding, healthcare and so on. So consumer spending. There'll be many items. You could buy products for the home, and we could buy entertainment, meals out. So these are items in which we spend income. Investment is the sum of expenditures on capital equipment, inventories and on structures for business. It includes machinery, unsold products and housing. These are new capital equipment. They're not second-hand. If they're second-hand, they've already been accounted for in the accounts earlier. So to avoid the problem of double counting, we say they're new capital equipment, new inventories and new structures. They haven't been accounted for before. Government spending is the sum of expenditures by all government bodies on goods and services. It includes naval ships, salaries to government employees, all the items that government spend on education sector, on health sector, on roads, on all the different areas of expenditure. Net exports equals the difference between spending on domestic goods by foreigners and spending on foreign goods by domestic residents. In other words, net exports describes the difference between imports and exports. So net exports is the difference between exports and imports. Now, GDP versus GNP. Well, GDP is just one way of measuring the total output of the economy. It's the sum value of all goods and services produced within the country. So GDP is goods and services produced within the country. Gross domestic product. Domestic within the country. Gross national product, or GNP, is another method. GNP is the sum value of all goods and services produced by permanent residents of a country, regardless of their location. So GNP looks at all the residents of the country, all the permanent residents of the country, no matter where they happen to be when they make production or when they produce items. So they could be working abroad, but still resident of the UK. If they're resident of the UK and working abroad, their output abroad will be added in the gross national product. The important distinction between GDP and GNP rests on the differences in counting production by foreigners in a country and by nationals outside the country. So when foreigners live in the UK and produce items, those are not counted. Those are not part of the gross national product for the UK. and items produced outside of the country by nationals of the country are included. For GDP of a particular country, production by foreigners within that country is counted, and production by nationals outside of the country is not counted. So GDP is different. It counts what foreigners produce within the country, and it excludes what people, say British people overseas, are making overseas, because they're overseas. So it's gross domestic product. Gross domestic product relates to what happens within the country. So foreigners produce within the country, that's included. British people who live overseas, their output is not counted because it's not domestic. It wasn't produced domestically. For Gnp, production by foreigners within a country is not counted, and production by nationals outside of the country is counted. So foreigners living within, say, the UK, who produce something, that item is not counted. It's produced by foreigners, so it's not counted as part of the gross national product. But output by British people living overseas is counted. So that particular paragraph there, I think, summarizes the distinction between the two. So while GDP is the value of goods and services produced within the country, GNP is the value of goods and services produced by the citizens of a country. Doesn't matter where they are. For GNP, it's just output produced by the citizens of the country, if they're living domestically or living overseas. But GDP is the goods and services produced within a country. In general, macroeconomists rely on GDP as a measure for the country's total output. In general, this is what we talk about. We talk about gross domestic product when we talk in macroeconomic terms. That's the most widely used measure for the total output of the country and the total size of the country. That's how we measure it, by GDP. Now, the growth rate of GDP. Well, in order to calculate the growth rate of nominal GDP. Nominal means not allowing for inflation, just what is reported. There's no refinement to the calculation. It's the nominal GDP. It's just the numbers that are reported. We need two nominal numbers. Now that sounds like sounds bordering on bad English. Two nominal numbers. But what we mean here is numbers that are not adjusted for inflation. We have a particular meaning. It means numbers not adjusted for inflation. So we have two nominal numbers in two different years. Let's say year 1 and year 2. So the formula for calculating the GDP rates, well, it's the GDP in year 2 divided by the GDP in year 1 minus 1. So that's the growth rate of GDP. It's GDP in year 2 divided by GDP in year 1 minus 1. All minus 1. For example, in a country X, let's say, in year 1, GDP was, say, £20,000. In year 2, it increased to £22,000. So 22 divided by 20 minus 1 equals 1.1 minus 1, which is equal to 0.1, which is equal to 10%. So the growth rate was 10%. The country grew by 10%. And that's how we work out the growth rate. There's an obvious problem with this method of computing growth in total output. Increases in the price of goods produced. Well, those are ignored. You can see prices are not calculated here. You can see to just simply take the gross domestic product in year 2 divided by the gross domestic product in year 1 minus 1, and that equals the growth rate. But of course, prices could have changed between year 1 and year 2. Increases in the quantity of goods produced lead to increases in GDP. So increases in the quantity of goods produced lead to changes in GDP. But prices could also make it look like GDP has increased, when in fact only the price level may have increased. From the GDP growth rate, it's therefore difficult to determine if the amount of output that is changing if it is the amount of output that is changing, or if it's the price of the output undergoing change. So when we work out the 10% above, was that 10% caused by more output coming on the market, or simply prices going up? So the same amount of output came on the market, just that prices were different. So we need to determine whether inflation was causing that increase in percentage, or was it output. So instead of working out nominal numbers, as we said at the top, we should work out real numbers. Real numbers are numbers which are adjusted for the rate of inflation, for the changes in prices, which gives us the real changes, the real output. The limitation means that an increase in GDP does not necessarily imply an economy that's growing. So if we don't allow for inflation, if we don't allow for changes in prices, we can't really say if it's output that's increased or prices that have increased. So we need to work this one out. Otherwise, that figure is ambiguous. If, for example, a country produces 5 cars a year at a price of £10,000 each, in the next year the price of cars increases to, let's say, £13,000 each, the GDP of the country has increased by 15,000. But no more cars are produced. So it produces 5 cars each year, let's say, and the first year it sells the cars for £10,000. The next year it sells it for £13,000. So if you like, the sales in the first year was £50,000. In the second year it's £65,000. We'll take 50,000 from 65,000, £15,000. It looks like GDP has gone up by £15,000, but it hasn't. It's prices that have gone up. It's still the same number of cars. This problem can make comparison of GDP from one year to the next difficult, as changes in GDP are not necessarily due to economic growth. So let's look at the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. Generally, two types of GDP are used: nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is the sum value of all produced goods and services at current prices. That's nominal. Real GDP is the sum of all goods, produced goods and services at constant prices. So nominal is taking the price today, the price now when the output is produced. And next year when the output is produced, it'll take the prices that are relevant then. That's nominal. Real takes one price, a constant price, and compares over time periods using that one constant price. The price used in the computation of real GDP, or the prices used, are based on a specific base year. So they take some base year and then compare all the prices that follow with that base year. By keeping the prices constant in the computation of real GDP, it's possible to compare the economic growth from one year to the next in terms of production of goods and services rather than market value of these goods and services. So it's looking at the output. If the items are priced at some base level price, then any changes to, say, GDP must be caused by output changes, because the prices are not relevant. In this way, real GDP frees year-to-year comparisons of output from the effects of changes in prices, because the prices are simply taken out of account. It's a base price. That's it. Now, to calculate real GDP, choose a base year. So back to our apples and onions. Here's our economy, 1, 2, 3 years. Here are the prices and here are the quantities produced. Now, For example, calculate the real GDP for year 3 using year 1 as the base year. So what's the real GDP for year 3 using year 1 as the base? Well, in this case, if we look carefully at the table now, we have, first of all, we'll deal with apples. Well, in year 3, the quantity of apples is 11. 11 apples are produced. The price of apples in the base year, year 1, is £1. The quantity of onions produced in year 3 is 12, and the price of onions in the base year is £3. So the real GDP is 47. So what we've done is we've taken the base prices, the base year prices, and we said multiply those base year prices by the current outputs in year 3, and that determines the real GDP. For comparison, the nominal GDP for year 3, well, the nominal for year is the quantity of apples is 11, the price in year 3 is 2, so 11 times 2, 22, plus quantity of onions is 12, and the price of onions is 3. 3 12s, 36. 36, 22 is 58. So the nominal GDP figure for year 3 is 58. The real GDP is 47. So now we can see the increase in the quantity and the effects of the increase in the quantities by looking at the real GDP. Because of the price of apples has increased from year 1 to year 3, the nominal GDP increased more than the real GDP over the same period. The nominal GDP takes into account the increase in the quantities produced and the increase in the price, whereas the real GDP only takes into account the increases in quantity. When comparing GDP between years, nominal GDP and real GDP capture different elements of the change. Nominal GDP captures both changes in quantity and changes in prices. That's important. So nominal GDP captures changes in both quantity and prices. Real GDP, on the other hand, captures only changes in quantity and is insensitive to the price level. So that's the big difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Because of this difference, after computing nominal GDP and real GDP, a third useful statistic can be computed. The Gdp Deflator is the ratio of the nominal GDP to the real GDP for a given year minus 1. So this is a Gdp Deflator. And what it does is it compares nominal GDP to real GDP for a given year. In effect, the Gdp deflator illustrates how much of the change in the GDP from a base year is reliant on changes in the price level. Let's see how it works in practice. Here's our table again for apples and onions. For example, let's calculate using the Gdp deflator for country X in year 3, using year 1 as the base year. Now, in order to find the Gdp deflator, we first must determine both the nominal GDP and the real GDPs in year 3. So, nominal GDP in year 3, as we calculated earlier, 58. And the real GDP, year 1 as the base year, was 47. The ratio of the nominal GDP to the real GDP is 58 divided by 47 minus 1, which is 23.4%. So the deflator is 23.4%. This means that the price level rose 23.4% from year 1, the base year, to year 3, the comparison year. So now we can work out what the deflator means. It means that the price level rose by 23.4% between those years. Rearranging the terms in the equation for the GDP deflator allows for the calculation of nominal GDP multiplying real GDP and GDP deflator. So if we look at how we worked out the GDP deflator, we can work out real GDP or nominal GDP if we know the deflator. We've got an equation in effect. We've got three variables. Let me go back to the previous slide. Over here we've got three variables. We've got nominal GDP, real GDP, and we've got the deflator. So if we've got three variables, we've got one equation. That means we're able to solve it for real GDP, we're able to solve it for nominal GDP, or we're able to solve it for the deflator just by moving the terms around. This equation demonstrates the unique information shown by each of these measures of output. Real GDP captures changes in quantity. The GDP deflator captures changes in the price level. And nominal GDP captures both changes in prices and changes in quantities. So now we're able to take the figures and work out real GDP, what's happened to output over that period. And we can work out also what's happened to prices over the period, and we can work out the nominal one, which is just an aggregate of changes in prices and changes in quantities. By using nominal GDP, real GDP, and the GDP deflator, you can look at a change in GDP and break it down into its component changes in price level and changes in quantities produced. So providing we have enough information, providing we know what the deflator is, and we know what the nominal GDP is, then we can work out the real GDP. Providing we have two pieces of information, we can work out the third. GDP per capita, the output per head, the output per person living in the country. Well, this is the single most important number when describing the size and growth of a country's economy. What we want to know is, how does it affect us? It's pointless talking in billions like governments do. We want to know, how does it affect us as individuals? How are we doing? An important thing to consider, though, is how GDP is connected with standard of living, because we're really not interested even in the economy. We're more interested in how we're doing. How does it affect our lives? How does it affect our standard of living? After all, the citizens to a country, the economy itself, is less important than the standard of living that it produces. We're more interested in our standard of living than in let's say, the state of the economy. Although of course, we have to bear in mind both are totally linked. GDP per capita, the GDP divided by the size of the population gives the amount of GDP that each individual gets on average, and thereby provides an excellent measure of standard of living within the economy. So we look at the gross domestic product for the country. What are the items produced within the country? And divided by the number of people living in the country. And on average, that tells us the standard of living. Now, of course, there are lots of problems with this. For example, the distribution of income. Not everybody gets the same income within the country. Some people are extremely rich, some people are very poor. So, on average, we have to look at the distribution of income, not just the average itself. Because GDP is equal to national income, the value of GDP per capita is therefore the income of a representative individual. It's an average. This number is connected directly to standard of living. That actually is quite controversial, but that's the way we accept it. We think the higher the GDP, the higher the standard of living. Well, yes and no. There are arguments against it. For example, higher GDP may be associated with more pollution, more environmental damage, more greenhouse effect. It could be higher standards of living change the society for the worst. We become more isolated as individuals and more work orientated and less sociable, and all sorts of issues need to be taken into account. But generally speaking, we believe there is a strong connection between the level of the economy, the state of the economy, and standard of living. And in general, the higher the GDP per capita in a country, the higher the standard of living. That's widely accepted. We certainly need the resources to promote our standard of living, to pay for health care and education and so on. But I'm just saying there are negative effects as well that need to be taken into account. GDP per capita is a more useful measure than GDP for determining standards of living because of differences in populations across countries. When we're trying to work out who's richer, which country, we look at the size of the countries and we look at their GDP per head. So you might find some very small countries are very high per capita income, whereas some very large countries may have very low per capita income. But in total, of course, the large countries are much wealthier than the small countries. It's just when we divide by the population, we find they're much poorer. If a country has a large GDP and a very large population, each person in the country may have a low income and thus may live in poor conditions. And we see this in many powerful countries. Many large, powerful countries with very large populations. When we divide the GDP of that country by the number of people, we find that they are very poor. And of course, that may be exacerbated by the fact that there is an unequal distribution of income within the countries. We're talking here about the average. As I said, there may be some very rich people within the country, which means that other people must be much poorer. On the other hand, a country may have a moderate GDP, but a very small population that have a high individual income. Small countries, Monaco, or Luxembourg. They've got small populations, but they've got relatively high standards of living. Using GDP per capita measures to compare standards of living across countries avoids the problem of division of GDP among the inhabitants of the country. So, using the GDP per capita measure to compare standards of living across countries avoids the problem of division of GDP among the inhabitants of a country. Just looking at GDP per capita across countries is a rough indicator of how the countries are performing. We have to bear in mind here that we're dealing with statistics. It takes a long time to collect these statistics, and when they're collected there may be many errors in the statistics, many problems associated with the compilation of the tables and even the computation of the numbers. So we're dealing with issues here which are fraught with inaccuracies and errors and so on. But it's the best we've got. So when we want to compare countries, this is one way of doing it. So what we've looked at in this class is we've looked at GDP and Gnp, and we looked at how to calculate GDP, and we've looked at three measures that were important. The nominal GDP, the real GDP, and the deflator. These are important issues to bear in mind. We've looked at, just very briefly, some of the issues involved in collecting the data to calculate them, and we've looked at GDP per capita and the issues associated with trying to measure standards of living with economic statistics. And we've talked about the differences in sizes of country and the differences that populations can make to GDP figures. But that's all I'm going to deal with in this session now, so I'm going to leave it at that and say Thank you for watching.